Hi everyone, welcome to a new year and a new decade if you are operating on this particular calendar, and also welcome to History on Trial. We are going to be starting a series on the AMORITES, also known as the AMURRU or the AMORI. This is part one, and what we're going to be doing in this part one is we're just going to be looking very quickly at some depictions, some historical depictions of the AMORI, the AMURRU, the AMORITES. We're going to be looking at those depictions, and we're going to be looking a little bit at symbology. We're also going to focus on these atypical features in these depictions. We're going to do a little bit of a historical backdrop, just a really basic backdrop. We're also going to talk about some of the psychological traits that can be inferred from the basic history that's provided. Then we're going to, in subsequent discussions, we're going to look at the diaspora of the AMORITES. We're going to look at things like etymology and cognates. We're going to look at the destruction of the AMORITES or the AMURRU. We're also going to look at the migration of this particular group, the proliferation, and the implications of all of that. And this is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. If this video appears on anything other than Dr. Tracy McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. We're going to be looking at the psychology of identity with the ancient AMORITES, AMORI, AMURRU. And let's start off looking at some statues. And this first statue is a statue of Abe, and this is noted as the superintendent of Mari. And Mari is in the east. If you are in the United States, Mari is in the east, what would be considered Western Asia. And this is the superintendent of Mari. And so Mari is an actual location. And so what I want to turn your attention to is this dynamic of this phenotype. And so the phenotype incorporates a number of dynamics. One dynamic is the use of the color blue for the eyes. Another dynamic is that the eyes are very large. In some instances, the eyes are protruding, and in some instances, the eyes are flat against the face and extremely large. Now these are very large eyes also. You'll notice that it's set in this alabaster depiction here, and it's an interesting phenotype just all the way around. And you'll note as we look at some other depictions that this phenotype is pretty pervasive. And here we see some additional depictions of the ancient AMORITES. And so these are supposed to be depictions of that particular group of people, also known as the AMORI. And you can see again, these depictions include these very enlarged eyes, these very enlarged pupils, and sometimes the whites of the eyes are also enlarged. The phenotype varies, however, aside from the eyes, and so you may see differences in terms of the structure of the lips, the structure of the nose, the structure of the head, but what remains consistent is this dynamic of this atypical depiction with the phenotype related to the eyes. Now you can see a closer look at that first statue, and you can see the eyes are extremely large in terms of the relationship between the eyes and the rest of the face. And then you see another depiction of an AMORITE off to the right, and the eyes are extremely large, taking up half of the face. The pupils extremely large, and as is common in relation to this time period, you see a lot of noses missing, a lot of lips missing, lots of features missing, but what definitely stands out is this depiction of the eyes. And here you see additional depictions, again with the enlarged pupils and enlarged whites of the eyes in both instances. And here you see additional depictions again with the very large eyes. On the left-hand side, you can see the extremely large whites of the eyes. Also, you can see the The pupils again are enlarged, and together they are taking up almost half of the face. On the left hand side you can see that, and you can also see something similar on the right hand side. What does seem to vary, however, is the size of the pupil, and sometimes the pupil takes up almost the entire space, and then sometimes you see the pupil is enlarged, but the white is still larger. You still see some white space, and so in both depictions on the right hand side, you can see that dynamic where the pupil is taking up the entire space almost. And here you see some additional depictions of the AMURRU, again with these unusually large eyes in relation to the rest of the face. And in many ways, the eyes resemble the eyes of an owl. And so you can see a depiction of the owl in the middle there, and you can see the similarities between these depictions of the people who are supposed to be AMORI, AMORITES, and the owl. Now these are some additional depictions, and you can again see some dynamics with the eyes. It's not possible to show the total depiction on the right because it's inappropriate to show. And so, but you can also see the eyes where they are owl-like. And here you can see something from an excavation over on the right hand side. Again, you see a depiction with these flattened eyes, and what we're going to see is that this isn't just limited to the Amorites. This dynamic apparently has been noted in a couple of places, and we're going to look at that. You can also see some writing on the shoulder on the left hand side, just in case you are able to decipher that. Now, what's interesting is that you have similar depictions in relation to the Amorites or the AMORRU. You have similar depictions in Peru. This is interesting because also in Peru you have that name Tupac Amaru, which goes along with the Amorites, the AMORRU, AMURRU. Now let's quickly talk about some symbolism related to these depictions. Now the depictions, of course, can be accurate depictions. Perhaps there were people that actually looked like this during these ancient times. That's possible. Anything's possible. However, there are also symbolic dynamics going on. And so when you see those large eyes looking like owl eyes, basically, what that symbolizes is this dynamic of being able to operate in the dark. And so these individuals perhaps were seen as, or were portrayed as, operating in the dark. And this goes along with those large pupils because the pupils actually change size in order to maximize vision. And so low light would trigger this pupil dilation. And you also have an interesting dynamic with those light eyes, because light eyes also equal light sensitivity. And so there would be a preference for actually seeing in the dark or dim lighting. Sunlight would be a problem. And so operating in the dark is a dynamic that appears to go along with these depictions. And here you can see the depictions of the owls without those other depictions, and you can see how in some instances the whites of the eyes are very large, but the pupils are still really large, and the eyes are large in relation to the rest of the face, again taking up half of the face. It's not unusual to have human beings sometimes look like certain animals. This is unusual though, and so because it's not a standard thing to have eyes that are half of the size of the face. And so it's very interesting, those depictions, they just really do resemble the eyes and the face of the owl. And interestingly, going along with those depictions, there's a psychology and a symbology related to owls. And so owls tend to symbolize, and those eyes tend to symbolize intelligence, darkness. Again, owls operate in darkness. Owls symbolize secretiveness and farsightedness. They can't see very close. And also destruction. And so there is an interesting correlation between these depictions of the Amorites, the AMURRU, and the owl. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up with just a little bit of historical background about the AMURRU, the AMORI people. What we do know is they were considered an ancient Semitic-speaking people. This does not mean that they were Semitic. It means that they were Semitic-speaking, or their language was part of that language family. We also know that they dominated the history of Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine for a very long time. And you can see the time period 2000 to about 1600 BC. So this is a very ancient group we're talking about here. And the name equates to the West. There's a belief, however, that their original space, in terms of their origins, that they perhaps came out of Arabia. And we can also talk about this later, but there's also an indication coming out of India that that name, that root, that cognate is related to a Gotra. This is a family name, and so there is a belief that there is a lineage dynamic related to the AMORI. They were also known as nomads. They were considered troublesome. And were related to the downfalls of a number of kingdoms and dynasties over time, and particularly the third dynasty of Ur. And we also see here that during the second millennium BC, the Akkadian term AMURRU referred not only to an ethnic group, but also to a language and a geographic and political unit in Syria and Palestine. And so this is interesting because there is just this long history of conflict going on in that area, in Syria and Palestine. And you can see that it's been going on for a long period of time. This particular group is also involved in large-scale migrations and the creations of federations, sort of tribal federations, what you might consider as confederates. And so confederacies, they were really big in terms of confederacies. And also they occupied Babylonia. And so you can see these were very, very busy people. They got around quite a bit, and they created a number of kingdoms all over the place, which would equate to an empire ultimately. They were also known for assimilating people and cultures. And so there was a lot of assimilation and cultural appropriation. And so it's an interesting dynamic. And what has happened is that it has resulted in there's been so much mixing that it's very difficult to disentangle, who is Amorite or AMURRU or AMORI, and who is something aside from that. And so again, this proliferation has been great in terms of the expansiveness of it. And you can also see a notation that there's a belief that a large number of Babylonian kings were actually from that particular stock or that Gotra. And also one capital for Mori or Mari was in what is now Syria. And so you also see that part of its political center was also in Palestine, and then they mixed with the Hurrians. So this is a group of people who really got around, with this very atypical physical feature. So it's just very interesting that they were migrating and integrating with so many people. And you also have a region that's in Palestine right now known as AMURRU. So it goes along with this name. And so there's a lot of territory marking that appears to go on or appeared to go on with this ancient group. And so wherever they went, there was the giving of the name of those people. What's interesting here is this notation about the Dark Ages. And so there was apparently a Dark Age during the BC period. along with another dark age subsequent to that. So anyway, you also have this notation that the language of the Amorites or the AMURRU disappeared from Babylonia and the mid-Euphrates, but in Syria and Palestine it became dominant. And there's also indication that the term AMURRU designated part of Syria and all of Phoenicia and Palestine. But it came to be not just for a specific kingdom or language or a population, but just a general reference to people in a particular area. One of the things that you can make note of related to these patterns of the Amorites, the ancient Amorites, you can make note of some of the cultural traits or collective personality traits of that particular group of people. And so some of the psychological traits that you might make note of based upon the basic history and also based upon some of the history that we will discuss subsequent to this is that there is a pattern of assertiveness, very assertive people, very industrious people because they, engage in so much migration, very adaptable, highly adaptable in terms of climate and just geographic spaces. That's the good part. On the flip side of that, you have a dynamic of people that appear to be very meddlesome, very warlike, aggressive, dominating, what might be considered pretty hyperactive, unable to sit still, easily bored, moving from one place to another, encroaching on other people. And this ties into a lack of boundaries. And you can see this in individual personality traits, so not just this ancient group. And so a problem with boundaries, and when individuals or collectives have boundary difficulties, they also tend to be focused on empire building in terms of collectives. So not happy with just having their own villages and their own little kingdoms. They want to build empires, take over other spaces. Also into confederacies. You also have a dynamic when people are moving around to that degree historically, it becomes sort of like an invasive species. Broad breeders, meaning mixing with a large number of people. And so in many ways, there's the spreading of that genetic pool, but there's also the dilution of the genetic pool all at the same time. So very prolific people. They could be considered legion, ubiquitous, everywhere and in large numbers. Now, if you are even remotely familiar with Star Wars, it might be difficult to not notice the fact that not only do these depictions look atypical, these depictions don't look human. They look humanoid, perhaps. They look robotoid, perhaps, but they do not actually look human based upon the feature of the eyes in relation to everything else. And in fact, they look very similar to C-3PO from Star Wars. And so you can see the depiction of C-3PO in the middle, and then you see the other depictions to the left and the right of this focus on the eyes, and the one to the right in particular looks very similar to C-3PO. It looks like it could be the same person or a robot. Well, that wraps up our part one with History on Trial, focusing on the Amorites or the AMURRU, the AMORI, the psychology of identity. We've looked at some of the depictions of the AMORI, the Amorites. We looked at some symbology, focused on those atypical features, looked at the basic historical backdrop that's going to serve as the foundation of the rest of the discussion of the AMORI, the Amorites. We also looked at some psychological traits related to this particular ancient group, related to that basic history. And so we're going to follow this up with some discussion on the diaspora, etymologies, and cognates. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.